Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a really exciting mini series within this series of our exploration on our statement on philosophical liberalism. We are going to be getting into what is certainly the longest, densest section of our statement, which is all about the virtues. And because of that, we really did think it merited multiple conversations about virtue. And so this really tonight is going to be just the first in several episodes that will introduce the concept of virtue and why we think it is so important. And it's going to lead you, this is going to be a rather substantial series when you consider just the three parts of just talking about virtue broadly and then getting into the 11 virtues that we identified as being core to philosophical liberalism. But tonight, we're really just going to kick it off at the broadest level to really think about what virtue is, why virtue matters, and why it matters specifically for our core values of flourishing and greatness. And that I think will lead us into just further conversations about why it matters for freedom, our political project, and then specifically what we had in mind here with the statement and why we set it up the way we did with the 11 virtues that you will read. But I will turn it over now to my co founder and co host, Chris, and we'll get this conversation started. So, Chris, why is virtue so important and why are we giving it such time and emphasis in our project?
Yeah, thank you, Joia. So, as you all know, we're now into part two of Article Two of our three article statement. And Article Two overall, we call it Moral Applications of Philosophical Liberalism. And the way I like to think of it as we just finished talking about our ideals, the various different facets of the one ideal of the good life, of which I think we came to ultimately four, possibly even five facets, and I'm sure we'll add for future ones. Um, and we talked a lot about how we laid out those ideals to provide an inspiring and an ethical grounding framework for the cause of freedom and why freedom matters, to go beyond the kind of typical pragmatist or materialist economic arguments for freedom, and recognizing that people live by morality, whether they know it necessarily or not. We're moved towards a higher calling, towards values and ideas and ideals that are important to us, and our sense that grounding freedom in such a moral foundation, for which it definitely has a great one, that is in a critical piece of conveying its importance and inspiring a movement of more people to pick it up. So with that in mind, the virtues is real. We have the ideals on the one hand, and then the virtues here is really just the second half of that equation, that this is the other aspect of us grounding the cause of freedom in in a moral framework and a moral foundation, whereby the virtues are kind of the action piece, if you will. So that's what we were trying to do here, is to just this is just another dimension of our grounding freedom and the cause of it in a deeper moral why, if you will, going alongside the ideals which we already talked about. Um, and it also matches our entrepreneurial ethos of, we say we're not just about abstract theory and philosophizing, that we're about putting ideas into action, ultimately to live your life. And again, virtues, we're going to talk about them and what they really mean in a second here, but that they really are the action analog here as it pertains to the moral dimension of freedom. Um, and and yeah, like I said, and that it just gives us an inspiring reason for why freedom matters. And we'll talk about our answers for those questions. But just in the abstract, that's why. that's what virtues, that's the purpose virtue or the function virtues are serving here in our statement, is filling out the moral foundation for freedom's uh, purpose. But uh, I just lost my train of thought. What was I gonna say here? What- That
Why don't we just jump right
yeah,
into it because we have a lot to
I was
cover
like I
and
had something I really wanted to say here, but oh well, it'll come back to me
it'll
probably in
come
the
back to
middle of whatever you're saying.
well, and it's
Um,
probably good that we're spending 3 parts on this because even if you don't recall it today, it will definitely come to you before we're done
oh, I
thinking
know
about
what I
the
was going to
virtues.
say. That's the general point, and then I think the reason why we spent so much time and text on virtues specifically, and then even outlining 11 virtues as it pertains to our Freedom Project, is because in many ways we believe that virtues are kind of the missing link in the moral equation, at least in our contemporary domain and society. You know, a lot of people, I think, grasp the importance of ideas and ideals or values, you might say, synonymously, but you don't hear much talk about the kind of corresponding and supporting actions. And you almost never hear anybody even use the term virtue anymore. So I think that was, we grasped, perhaps even unknowingly at the time, that providing a real course of action, a roadmap, if you will, of how each of you all out there, each of us can kind of put these ideas into practice, that was something of big value as well here. And that we and it was our way of concretizing what we mean by a moral foundation. So um, with that, that's kind of a long-winded and brain blanked way of getting to your answer here.
Well, I'll just jump in and add, I don't think it was even unknowingly, as you suggested. I want to stake a claim that certainly there is a real problem in our current culture around virtue. And it's definitely something that I've seen on the entrepreneurial side, where entrepreneurs talk so much about vision and mission and values and don't talk about virtues. So this is definitely a conversation we need to have because it is absent in the current culture, but that's not the only reason. Even I think if we lived in a culture in which the proper role of virtue was recognized, virtue is so important to our project, to what we're doing, because as we're going to discuss, virtue is all about the actions that are required to actually make values happen. And because of the nature of our particular project, where we are all about thinking deeply through the values and the deep philosophical ideas, we are philosophical liberalism. We are equally, if not more so, committed to taking action, because as entrepreneurs we know this is where the rubber meets the road, the cash value, whatever phrase you want to have here. This is, ideas are just airy fairy abstractions that make no difference if you don't actually take action and make them real in the world, and that's what virtue is all about. So it absolutely matters, and we definitely need to have this conversation.
Yeah, and actually that reminds me, or I think that's a good um, prodding for us to maybe define our terms a little bit
Yes.
here. We talk about morality even and values and virtues. We've already invoked all three of those words multiple times in this conversation, and we will throughout this entire article too and beyond. But I don't think we've necessarily ever really defined them, and I think it'll help clarify things here. So, you know, when we talk about morality broadly, we talk about really just a guide to life, kind of um, how one chooses the goals that they want to pursue and then the course of action they need to take to achieve those goals. Um, in its kind of most neutral definitional sense, it doesn't necessarily imply a good or a bad course of action and a good or a bad goal. It just, I think that is what morality, I think, most serious thinkers strive to create a code of living that is positive or in their own way that they think is life-serving. Certainly that is our goal here, but that in a nutshell is what morality means. And I like to think of it as morality kind of as an equation equals values plus virtues. So values really are kind of there, those are the goals. They're the things, the ideas, the ideals that you want to achieve, and then virtues are the actions that you achieve them. And this particular, I think, way of framing it is very simplistic. I will give a nod to Ayn Rand, who I think really helped clarify this, because when you go and look at the dictionary definition of certainly virtues, it kind of is circular and self-references back to just morality, but even that is not well defined. So this is at least my own formulation of it. Joia had provided uh, some good background from Aristotle, going all the way back, who I think arguably was really the first philosopher, certainly in Western thought, to talk about morality in his famous Nicomachean Ethics treatise. So
Well,
if you want me to,
Plato did too, but I would say Aristotle really had the best to say, and I think he's certainly foundational to us, which is why I would love if you could even read just this description, which came from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy,
yeah,
but I
sure.
think even starts to lay a foundation
And
for
I think it's
what we're building
relatively
upon.
consistent with what I just laid out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a peer-reviewed academic resource. And this is on Aristotle ethics, just the intro, which basically captures our definitions here of concern. It reads, and it's a little long, so just bear with me. It reads, standard interpretations of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics usually maintain that Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC, emphasizes the role of habit in conduct. It is commonly thought that virtues, according to Aristotle, are habits, and that the good life is a life of mindless routine. And that the good life is a life of mindless routine. These interpretations, I'm reading this for the first time, by the way. I read Nicomachean Ethics, but that's not how I ever interpreted it. So that's an interesting
Well, but there are
way
lots of
of
readers who do, who
framing
that's
it.
maybe the
Yeah,
least charitable way of reading it. And this
I I would
philosopher is
agree.
going to make a different argument, and that
Uh,
validates Aristotle's project.
Yeah. So to continue on, these interpretations of Aristotle's ethics are the result of imprecise translations from the ancient Greek texts. Aristotle uses the word hexis to denote moral virtue, but the word does not merely mean passive habituation. Rather, hexis is an active condition, a state in which something must actively hold itself. Virtue, therefore, manifests itself in action. More explicitly, an action counts as virtuous, according to Aristotle, when one holds oneself in a stable equilibrium of the soul in order to choose the action knowingly and for its own sake. This stable equilibrium of the soul is what constitutes character. Similarly, Aristotle's concept of the mean is often misunderstood. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle repeatedly states that virtue is a mean. The mean is a state of clarification and apprehension in the midst of pleasures and pains that allow one to judge what seems most truly pleasant or painful. This active state of the soul is the condition in which all the powers of the soul are at work in concert. Achieving good character is a process of clearing away the obstacles that stand in the way of full efficacy of the soul. For Aristotle, moral virtue is the only practical road to effective action. What the person of good character loves with right desire and thinks of as an end with right reason must first be perceived as beautiful. Hence, the virtuous person sees truly and judges rightly, since beautiful things appear as they truly are only to a person of good character. It is only in the middle ground between habits of acting and principles of action that the soul can allow right desire and right reason to make their appearance as the direct and natural response of a free human being to the sight of the beautiful.
So I'll jump in here and say that clearly we have many differences with Aristotle, and we definitely take our theory of virtue in a different direction, but there is definitely a grounding and a certain fundamental similarity. So, first of all, just Aristotle's focus on a concept of moral excellence and flourishing that clearly is in alignment with our project of thinking about flourishing and greatness and recognizing that virtue, that this concept of action and taking right action is so crucial to what it's about. And also, I think I too, along with Aristotle, do equate virtue with character. I will use those terms synonymously to think about that we're building a character, but I absolutely love how he emphasizes that character itself is not just some thing, and it's not just some, you know, passive internal experience. It has to do with activity, and it has to do with activity in the world. And a combination of thinking and action is crucial to what it is to live a life that is flourishing, and ultimately, I would argue, a life that is great. And there's even, I think, a similarity. I don't think we will agree with Aristotle on all of the virtues that he lists in his lexicon. And we would have differences, I think, with some of his theory of the mean, the golden mean. But certainly our viewpoint on what we like to call the both ands has a lot of resonance, I do believe, with Aristotle's theory. So Aristotle is definitely an inspiration and foundation for at least my thinking as we approach this topic.
Okay. Yeah, and I think your point about using the term character and virtue synonymously, that hits home, that resonates. Although I would expand it maybe a little bit more broadly and say, to me, character is synonymous with morality more broadly, encompassing both the values and the virtues component. Because just as we, as human beings, are beings of both mind and body, reason, emotion, thought, and action, so too character comprises the actions you take, but then also the goals or the ideas you hold towards which those actions are directed. So so in that sense, this is again why we took so much pains, not pains, pleasures uh, in grounding so much of philosophical liberalism in the morality piece, because we recognize character is so important. I mean, especially when we talk about, especially in a free society, that the entire point of it is that you are judged not by the superficial characteristics of identity or deterministic, kind of material aspects of skin color, gender, etc., but by the content of your character. And I think most people understand that to mean the ideas you hold and the actions you take. Notwithstanding that, I think most people grasp that that's what we want to strive for in a free society, that that's what really matters in terms of judging people. I don't think we really hear many people talk about character these days in our society. And I would argue that insofar as if we feel that there's a glaring lack of character, virtue, and values driven living in our present world, it's precisely for this reason, that just this the concept of morality as such, much less its derivative components of good values and good virtuous actions, have been they're just not even really in the discussion anymore, much less do I think a lot of people are kind of consciously and proactively practicing or kind of striving towards it. So, I said to Joya in prepping for this discussion offline that it seems to me, I feel like there's a growing and accelerating trend in our present culture of a kind of, I kind of use the term amoralism, meaning kind of people just operating and living kind of outside of a moral framework as such, meaning kind of without any type of reference or direction towards a specific set of values, much less a kind of organized and integrated, systematic code of values, much less a life affirming positive one. And then, systematically kind of thinking through, okay, what are the actions I need to take to live that way? So, and I think, our digital age and the rise of certain technologies is only going to accelerate that trend if we don't kind of put a stake in the ground about the importance of morality. So that's just another reason why this was so important to us to ground this. Is we're trying to reclaim the importance of morality for your life in general, and then also connect it to the importance of a free society.
Absolutely. Well, I think this even harkens back to the observation. I don't even know who made it originally, but that definitely holds true that there's something curious about virtue in the tradition of Western civilization. That the concept, virtue, the vir means manliness, and the concept of virtue began as manliness in the Greco-Roman era, manliness in a man in the Greco-Roman era, and became virginity in women in the Christian era. And I think we're currently living in a time where, as a country, we have gone beyond Christian morality with pluses and minuses. I certainly don't identify as a Christian, and I would say there are certain of the values and virtues of Christianity that I do think are true and that are certainly worth practicing. And I think it's definitely better to have even a somewhat good morality than no morality at all. Although I obviously would disagree. I do not happen to think that chastity or virginity would be good virtues, in accordance with flourishing and greatness in a way that corresponds with the biology of human beings. That said, to your point, I think that as a society, we've equated morality, virtue with Christian, Judeo-Christian, perhaps, morality and virtue, and as society perhaps has gone beyond that in ways that are perhaps even wonderful, in ways that we are perhaps maybe more open to exploring other religions, other moral systems, but we've kind of now maybe gotten to a point where we don't even think
We
about
threw the baby out
morality.
with the
We've
bathwater.
thrown the baby out with the bathwater, to use that
Yeah.
phrase. And what we need, I do believe, is a new conception of morality, a new conception of virtue that is grounded in our scientific reasoning, in our best understanding of human nature and human possibility. And that is obviously a huge part of what we're trying to do here. So let's turn to this question then of why virtue is so important for flourishing and greatness, two of the three core values that we hold and are upholding with our statement.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think going through our kind of the definitions we just went through helps set this up nicely, at least in my mind, because as I was thinking through it, the way I kind of think of it is, as we've talked a lot about in Article 1, the kind of foundations in human nature at our best, human beings, we are beings of both mind and body, thought and action. And insofar as if we kind of accept that morality is the code of what to value and how to live that determines the course of your thoughts and actions, well, in philosophical liberalism here, we're putting forth that our three highest values and ideals are freedom, flourishing, and greatness. So if those are kind of the core values, then we kind of need to know how we're going to get them. And and we think they're the highest because they encompass a life well lived. So that's just even more incumbent on us to think about, okay, how do we achieve such an expansive, kind of ideal? And virtues are the specific actions, as we've said, in particular, good actions, life affirming actions, if you've got a good code of morality that leads you to achieving those values. So, um, you know, I think, those values, virtues are the answer to how do we achieve those values, I guess is the answer. And the way I like to even think about it is, um, I was saying to Joia, kind of the concept of flourishing and greatness in particular. We're going to set freedom aside separately because we're going to address that in its own whole discussion here in a few weeks as part of this little mini series on the intro to virtue. But for flourishing and greatness, virtue kind of they presuppose virtuous action and virtuous living. And if you recall, when we covered those two values of both flourishing and greatness, we even kind of outlined, on the one hand, for flourishing, Joy and I each had our own kind of 7 and 8 respective components or elements that comprised a flourishing life standard. And then we had our master unified theory of what we thought greatness meant. And there's a lot of, if you look through and go back and study through what all of those components entailed, there's a lot of virtues already kind of subsumed within those. It's kind of a mixture of values and virtues in each case. But the idea of those, part of why there are two of our three core values and they're so expansive is because they're kind of all encompassing to what we kind of term the good life or the ideal life. And so there's kind of contained within them many of the virtues you need. So this is why it's important, because you could say virtues are the specific good actions one needs to practice to achieve the character traits and values that flourishing, greatness, and a great ideal life well lived require. Or in other words, they're the pathway to achieving them and the high character they reflect.
And then, so maybe you want to say more too about your idea of virtue as being the widest category. The way I maybe like to think of this is virtue as a kind of spectrum. So, as we've said, there are, I do believe, hundreds of legitimate virtues that one might choose to pursue, some very dependent on the particular values that you want to achieve in your life. And certainly we want to argue for people to be virtuous. And there are maybe certain basic virtues that hopefully we see most people have, virtues of honesty or of working hard, of supporting their families, that these are all virtuous actions, but they don't yet perhaps rise to the level of flourishing, or then even further of greatness, that there are a certain set of virtues that would be that much more challenging to go from maybe just a few virtues in a life to the virtues that lead to flourishing, and then even beyond that, the virtues that lead to greatness.
Yeah, sure. And hearing you put it that way, it's just making me realize that I want to maybe step back just one quick second and just clarify or maybe sharpen the definition of virtue in the sense that, because we're talking about action here, right? And we talked about morality is really the code, the rule book, if you will, to guide your life of both what to value, what to pursue, and then how to achieve it, what actions to take. Um, so, you could say, as I said earlier, that is kind of value neutral, whether it's good or bad. We would argue, and I think most people who take morality seriously are focused on the good half of that. Um, but you could say, in an amoral sense, that, or a morally neutral sense, that you know, virtues could be all actions. Sleeping is an action, but when we talk about virtue, we're really talking about a subset of actions that lead to a kind of positive, that are life affirming, that lead to kind of a positive outcome, ultimately really a flourishing and great life. If one holds that as a possibility for human life, then virtues are really the subset of all actions one could take that are going to push you in that direction. So with just kind of that, even virtues, I guess you could say, are a subset of all the actions you could take, and they're a subset that pertain specifically to the actions that lead you towards a good life, a flourishing life, a moral life, etc. So, with that kind of said, yes, I agree with you, Joya, that virtues are maybe the widest category because it can be everything from honesty and justice and the 11 items we listed on our statement to productiveness and um, adaptable, accountability, all of these different character traits, as we call them, or actions you could take that are positive and help you live a better life. Those could all be under the category of virtue. But what we're going to say is that the higher, ultimately highest states of living that we've kind of set out as flourishing and greatness, those entail a kind of very specific subset of virtues in order to achieve. And we can, talk about what those might be for our specific conception of flourishing and greatness. But I think the point is, I would argue, if you live a life of flourishing and greatness, then you are inherently virtuous because you've taken all the actions and built the character that those values and ideals encompass. But I would argue on the flip side that one can be virtuous and not necessarily live a flourishing or great life because, again, there's hundreds of other good, still life affirming actions one can take that don't necessarily entail you living a flourishing or greatless life. And just to make it concrete, and let's use one of the classic virtues of honesty. One could be very honest and deal with people truthfully in the world, and that definitely makes you a virtuous person. But when we talk about flourishing as encompassing creativity and work as a central purpose of your life, and kind of combining competing poles, living a kind of both and duality and integration, and all these other things that Joy and I talked about in
Everything in your Magnificent Seven and
everything in
my
my
Elite
mag,
Eight
yep, my
for
mag seven
flourishing.
and her elite eight. um that's a separate category of actions, right? So one could be honest but not necessarily have done all the other things that flourishing entails, much less greatness, which, as we've already talked about, is kind of a higher state even above flourishing. So maybe that hopefully kind of just concretizes the issue for you. And to me, this is important because I think most people, notwithstanding what we said about the decline in virtue and moral living in our present age,
Well, at least in our prevalent discourse, in
in
terms
our
of what you
prevalent
read, yes,
perhaps,
and
yeah, yeah,
what
yeah,
what is spoken and
I think
what
that's a good
is talked about and
distinction.
emphasized
What's
in
talked about
conversation.
versus how people are living. Yeah, I
Yes.
think that's true. Because I do think many people do live virtuously in the sense of largely taking good life affirming actions and trying to organize them towards living what they define as a good life. Um, but doesn't necessarily mean it's at the level of flourishing and greatness that we're obviously trying to inspire and aspire to. So that's, I guess, just the distinction I'll draw there.
And I would say I agree that most people, I think, do try to be honest, hardworking, kind, supportive of their families, all these things that are virtuous, but that aren't yet the full picture of flourishing or yet of greatness that we see. And hopefully this is just a call to inspiration to build upon the virtues that you're already pursuing in your life, to expand that out and to just experience more of what the good life could be, to keep adding goodness and then even
Yes,
greatness to your
I love
life.
it. Yes.
So why don't we even, I think that makes a nice segue into our call to action for the week.
Sure. So our call to action this week is we've thrown out a lot of definitions, so we want to hear from you. What does virtue mean to you, and what do you think are the most important virtues? Let's even set aside the kind of more narrow subset that our statement ultimately goes into of as we're going to talk about the virtues, the key virtues we identified for a free society, a citizen in a free society. Let's just look more broadly at the living the good life and what you think are the most important virtues for you in your life.
I'm definitely going to be curious to hear what people come up with, and then even, we can definitely have room to refine our own lists as we.
Well, I was going to say, I think this is actually a good one for you and I to brush up on, and maybe we'll even start the next session sharing, because I know this was an outstanding exercise for us both to do, which I'm not sure if we ever did talk about it. I know you had shared one or two of yours with me, but I think we had. This is actually a perfect example where. This helped Joy and I even tease out this issue of virtue and different contexts and different sets of virtues, because I think we had pointed out that while we have our list of 11 in our statement, those aren't necessarily hers or mine, kind of 11 most important virtues for an overall well-lived life. So,
Well, so I definitely agree with Aristotle that pride is the crown of the virtues and perhaps one of my favorite, and that one didn't merit the list of our 11 for our particular project, which was the Free Society. So
right.
yes,
Okay. Cool. All right. We'll see you all in a few weeks.
see you all soon.